The alarm woke me before my own thoughts did. Red light spilled across the ceiling of my quarters, pulsing in time with a sound I had not heard in 11 years. A sound built only for one purpose: to tell every soul on this station that something above us had changed, and none of it was good. I was on my feet before I understood why. My name is Elias Voss, and that night I was still only a mid-level liaison officer, not yet the man the whole world would later call the last speaker. I pulled on my uniform with hands that would not stop shaking, and stepped into a corridor already filling with people who looked as frightened as I felt. Grace Whitmore was waiting outside my door, her tablet pressed against her chest like a shield. She had been my closest friend since our training years, sharp-eyed, quick-tongued, the kind of person who never wasted a word. "They moved a fleet into our system 3 hours ago," she said, walking fast enough that I had to hurry to keep pace. 12 ships, council make, sitting just past our outer marker, not answering hails. "Why now?" I asked. "We have followed every quarantine rule for 2 decades. Because 2 decades was apparently the trial period," she said, "and somebody up there decided we failed it." We reached the command deck to find it already crowded, screens glowing with tactical feeds none of us had ever needed before. 12 alien vessels hung in the dark beyond our defense line, patient, silent, arranged in a formation that any cadet could recognize as a blockade. Not an invasion, not yet. A door being closed before it was slammed shut for good. Director Ashford stood at the center of it all, a tall man with gray hair and the calm voice of someone who had spent his whole career learning how to sound steady when nothing around him was. He turned when he saw me. "Voss. Good. I need you." "For what?" I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer and did not want it confirmed. "A transmission came through the checkpoint relay an hour ago," he said. "Council High Formal. It says the 900 chairs have called an emergency session. Subject, the continued existence of the human quarantine agreement." He paused, and in that pause I heard 11 years of dread finally arriving at its destination. They are debating whether to end it by ending us. The room went quiet enough that I could hear the station's air recyclers humming behind the walls. "That is not a debate," Grace said. "That is a sentence waiting for a signature." "Which is why we are not going to sit here and wait for it," Ashford said. He looked directly at me, and I understood, before he said another word, exactly what he intended to ask. "Every species in that chamber is granted 1 seat when a matter concerns their survival. 1 voice. We have never used ours. I need someone to go and use it now, tonight, before that fleet decides waiting has gone on long enough." "Me," I said, and it did not come out as a question so much as a plain refusal to believe it. "You speak 4 council dialects fluently. You have studied their law longer than anyone on this station, and you are the only person I trust to walk into that chamber and not lose their nerve in front of 800 watching worlds." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him he had the wrong man, that somewhere on this station there was someone braver, someone who had not spent the last hour convincing his own hands to stop trembling. But the fleet outside our window did not care about my doubts, and neither, I suspected, would the vote waiting for us on the other side of the galaxy. "When do I leave?" I asked instead. "Within the hour," Ashford said. "A retrieval ship is already inbound to collect you. Council protocol. You travel alone, unarmed, under their escort the whole way." "Alone," Grace repeated, and for the first time that night her sharp composure cracked just slightly. "Elias, if this goes wrong, there will be no one there to carry word back." "Then it cannot go wrong," I said, though I had no idea yet how true, or how strange, that sentence would turn out to be. They gave me 20 minutes to gather what little I was permitted to bring: a single coat, a data slate loaded with nothing more suspicious than family photographs, and 1 audio file whose purpose even I did not fully understand yet, because the file itself had been prepared years earlier, by people far above my rank, sealed and waiting for a night exactly like this one. I found my sister Laura at the transport bay before I left, having heard the alarms and come running in her nightclothes with our father's old coat thrown over her shoulders. She did not cry. She has never been someone who cries in front of people, even the people she loves most. "You are going to talk to the ones who put a fence around our whole planet," she said, not quite a question. "I am going to try to talk them out of tearing the fence down and everything behind it with it," I said. "And if talking does not work?" I did not have an answer for her that night. I only had a coat, a data slate, and a countdown that had already started somewhere far above our heads, in a chamber I had never seen, among faces that had already decided, long before I arrived, exactly what kind of species they believed us to be. The retrieval ship was called the Adjudicator's Reach, and it slid into our system without warning, sleek and silver and utterly silent, the way only Council engineering ever managed to be. A boarding tunnel extended from its hull to our station's outer ring, and I walked through it with Grace's last words following me the whole way. "Come home, Elias," she had said. "Whatever happens up there, come home." I stepped aboard not knowing if that would be a promise I could keep, only that somewhere behind me, an entire planet was holding its breath, waiting to learn whether the next voice to speak for humanity would be mine, or whether there would be no voice left to speak at all. The captain of the Adjudicator's Reach met me just inside the airlock. He was a Thren, bronze-skinned, sharp-featured, with eyes that moved over me the way a merchant's eyes move over goods he has already decided are worthless. His name, the display beside the hatch told me, was Kavosh. "Elias Voss," he said, testing the syllables. "The human they are sending to argue for a species that has already been measured and found wanting." "I have not argued yet," I said. "Perhaps wait until I do before deciding how it ends." Something flickered behind his eyes, not quite respect, not yet, but curiosity. And in the long journey ahead of us, curiosity would prove far more valuable to me than sympathy ever could have been. Behind us, through the small viewport near the airlock, I watched my home fall away into the dark, one bright point among billions, guarded now by 12 ships that had come not to protect it, but to make certain nothing inside it escaped before a verdict was reached. I did not know yet what waited at the end of this journey. I did not know that the file resting quietly on my data slate held more power than every warship humanity had ever built. I only knew that somewhere ahead of me, 900 voices were preparing to decide whether my species deserved to keep existing, and I had exactly one voice with which to answer them. The engines of the Adjudicator's Reach came alive beneath my feet, and the ship turned away from Earth, carrying me toward a chamber where, in a matter of days, everything either would be saved or would be lost, and there would be no version of events where nothing at all had changed. The corridor lights dimmed to a resting glow as the ship broke away from our system's edge, and for the first time since the alarms had woken me, I found myself alone with nothing but the hum of engines and the terrible size of what waited ahead. Kavash had left me at the observation lounge with a simple instruction: rest if I could, because the journey to Threndal Prime was not short, and a tired voice, he warned, rarely persuades anyone of anything. I did not rest. I sat with the data slate open in my lap, scrolling through the family photographs that had been placed there as harmless decoration, my mother in her garden, my father laughing at something out of frame, Laura as a child holding a fish twice the size of her arms. Beneath all of it, untouched, sat the single audio file no one on the station had explained to me in full, only that I was to play it if, and only if, the moment demanded something beyond words. I did not open it, not yet. I was too afraid of what listening to it alone, in the dark, might mean about how close we truly were to needing it. Grace's voice came to me from a recorded message she must have sent the moment the ship cleared our defense line, timed to arrive once I was too far to answer back. I played it once, sitting very still. "Elias," it began, "by the time you hear this you are already gone, and there is nothing I can say that will make that easier, so I am not going to try. I am going to tell you instead what I believe, because I think you need to hear it more than you need comfort. I believe you were chosen because you are the only person on this station who has never once, in 11 years, mistaken caution for weakness. Do not let a room full of frightened old species convince you that patience means we have nothing behind it. Come home. We will be waiting." I closed the message and sat with it a long while before the ship's gentle chime told me a jump gate was approaching, the first of 6 that would carry me across more distance than my entire species had crossed in the whole of its recorded history. The first jump gate hit me harder than I expected, a pull behind my ribs that made the whole ship groan around me, and when my vision cleared, the stars outside the viewport had rearranged themselves into a pattern I had never seen from any window on Earth. Kavash found me still gripping the armrest when he came to check on his unusual passenger. "First jump is always the worst," he said, not unkindly. "Your body has not yet learned to stop arguing with the physics." "How many more?" I asked. 5, he said. 11 days. If the corridors stay clear. And if they do not stay clear? He did not answer that question, and something in his silence told me it was not a question he wanted to answer honestly in front of me, not yet. The days that followed fell into an uneasy rhythm. I slept in short pieces, ate meals that tasted of nothing I recognized, and studied every scrap of council law I had brought with me until the words blurred together into a single long argument I could recite without thinking. Kavash, to my surprise, became something close to a companion during that stretch of silence between stars, though neither of us would have called it friendship yet. On the fourth day, he found me in the observation lounge again, watching a nebula bleed color across the dark outside the hull. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Off the record, as your people say." "You may ask," I said. "I make no promises about answering." "Your species built nothing in 22 years of quarantine. No weapons detected, no forbidden research, nothing our sensors ever flagged as a threat. And yet the chairs speak of humanity as though you are a blade someone forgot to put away. Why does a species that built nothing frighten so many of my people so completely?" I thought carefully before answering, because I understood even then that whatever I said to him might, in some form, reach the ears that mattered most before I ever set foot in that chamber. "Perhaps," I said, "your sensors were only ever built to find the kind of danger your own people already understand. A weapon that looks like a weapon. A fleet that looks like a fleet. It is possible we simply never gave you anything that matched the shape you were searching for." He studied me for a long moment, and I watched the curiosity in his eyes sharpen into something closer to concern. "That is either the most reassuring thing a human has ever said to me," he said slowly, "or the least." "Perhaps it is both," I said, and left it there, because I had not yet decided myself which one was true. On the sixth day, an alert tore through the ship loud enough to send me from my bunk before I was fully awake. I reached the bridge to find Kavash already at his station, his crew moving with the tight, practiced urgency of people who had rehearsed this exact moment many times before, though clearly never with a human passenger aboard. "What is happening?" I asked. "A patrol flagged us at the edge of the fourth corridor," he said, not looking up from his controls. "Unregistered vessel matching our profile. They believe we may be carrying contraband, or worse, given the destination logged in our transit papers." "Worse than contraband?" "You, Elias Voss," he said. "There are those in this galaxy who would rather your voice never reached the chamber at all, and would consider intercepting this ship a reasonable price to pay for silence." My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the artificial gravity. Who would go that far? "The same delegations who have spent 2 decades building their careers on the argument that your species should never have been contacted in the first place," he said. "A quarantine ended peacefully makes them look foolish. A quarantine ended with your extinction makes them look correct. You can imagine which outcome they prefer." Before that alert ever sounded, on the 5th day of our journey, we had crossed paths with a lone trading vessel drifting near the edge of the third corridor, its hull scarred from what looked like decades of honest, difficult travel. Kavash had slowed our approach to exchange the standard greeting required of any 2 ships meeting in open space, a courtesy I had assumed would take only a few minutes. The trader who answered our hail introduced herself as Petra Lindholm, a weathered woman with silver-streaked hair, and a voice roughened by years spent talking her way past customs officials on a dozen different worlds. She ran cargo between the Outer Council territories, she explained. Small goods, spare parts, nothing glamorous. And she had heard, through channels faster than any official broadcast, exactly who Kavash carried aboard his ship. "The human," she said, studying me through the view screen with open curiosity. "I did not expect to see one of you out here. Most of my customers still speak of your world the way children speak of a locked room in an old house, something they are told to fear without ever being told why. I am hoping to change what they are told," I said. "Are you?" she said, and something in her tone made it clear she had heard promises like mine before, from other species, in other disputes, and had learned not to trust them easily. "I trade with worlds on both sides of every council quarrel that has ever mattered. I have watched quarantines lifted before, Speaker Voss. I have also watched a few of them lifted only long enough for the worst outcome to happen anyway, once everyone stopped watching closely." "Then perhaps you can tell me something useful," I said. "You hear things official channels never bother repeating. Is there anything moving through this corridor I should know about, before I stand in front of that chamber?" She considered the question longer than I expected, glancing briefly at something off-screen before answering. "There is a rumor," she said carefully, "that a handful of delegates who fought hardest for your quarantine 2 decades ago have grown nervous these past months, watching how quietly your species has behaved despite everything done to you. Nervous people sometimes make arrangements quietly, Speaker Voss, arrangements that never appear on any official schedule until it is far too late to stop them." "What kind of arrangements?" I asked. "I only carry cargo," she said, "not secrets. But I will tell you this for free, because I have found, in my years of trading, that a kindness costs nothing and sometimes returns a great deal. Watch the corridors you are not told to watch. That is where arrangements like these are usually made." She signed off soon after, her ship drifting away into the dark, and Kavash watched her go with an expression I could not quite read. "Do you trust her?" I asked. "I trust that traders like her survive by knowing things official channels do not," he said. Whether her warning means anything specific, I cannot say, but I would be a poor captain if I ignored it entirely. It was that warning, more than anything else, that made the patrol encounter which followed a day later feel less like routine bad luck, and more like the first thread of something larger, beginning to pull taut. The patrol ship, a lean gray vessel bristling with weapon ports I did not need a military background to recognize as serious, closed the distance between us with the unhurried confidence of something that expected no resistance. Kavash opened a channel, and a voice on the other end, clipped and impatient, demanded we power down for inspection. "This vessel operates under direct council writ," Kavash answered, his voice utterly steady, though I noticed his hand had not left the console. "Carrying an accredited last speaker to an emergency session of the 900 chairs. Interference with this transit is a violation you will need to answer for personally, and I promise you, the ones waiting at the other end of my writ do not forgive such violations quietly." There was a long pause on the other end, long enough that I found myself holding a breath I had not realized I was holding. "Writ confirmed," the voice finally said, cold and clearly unhappy about it. "You are cleared to proceed. This encounter will be logged, as will your attempt to delay a matter of galactic importance," Kavash answered, and closed the channel before the other captain could respond. The patrol ship peeled away, and the bridge exhaled as one body. I realized my hands were shaking again, the same tremor from the night the alarms first woke me, and I hated myself a little for how easily it had returned. "That was close," I said. "That was routine," Kavash corrected, though the tightness around his eyes told a different story. "There will be others before we reach Threndal Prime. Some may not stop at demanding an inspection." "Then why help me?" I asked. "You owe my species nothing. You laughed at me on the day we met." "I did," he admitted, "and I have thought of very little else since. A species that built a hidden network across an entire star system without a single sensor in this galaxy detecting it is not a species I intend to be on the wrong side of, Speaker Voss. I would rather be the captain who delivered you safely than the captain remembered for delivering you to your death." It was the first time anyone outside my own government had spoken the word network aloud in my presence, and it landed heavier than I expected, a reminder that whatever waited folded quietly inside my data slate, others across the galaxy had already begun to suspect its shape, even if none of them yet understood its true size. We crossed the remaining jump gates without further incident, though every quiet stretch of travel now felt loaded with a tension that had not existed before the patrol encounter. I spent those final days rehearsing not just arguments of law, but the plain, simple truths I intended to speak if law alone proved insufficient, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I had already begun to suspect that no amount of careful legal language would be enough to change 900 minds that had already decided what they believed about my species. On the 10th day, Threndal Prime appeared in the viewport as a point of light indistinguishable from any other star, and by the 11th, it had grown into a planet wrapped in 3 shining rings of habitat stations, more populated than every world humanity had ever touched combined. Kavash stood beside me as we made our final approach, watching the same view I watched. "Do you understand what is being decided today, Speaker?" he asked, echoing almost exactly the question he had asked me on the first day we met, though his voice now carried none of the amusement it had held then. "I do," I said. "My species' survival." "No," he said quietly, surprising me. "I think by now, it is something larger than that. I think it is whether a galaxy built on 900 old certainties is prepared to admit one of those certainties might finally be wrong." The ship began its descent toward the chamber's docking spire, and somewhere below us, in a bowl of golden light 3 kilometers across, 900 delegates were already gathering to decide, once and for all, whether the voice I carried inside a single unopened audio file would ever need to be heard at all, or whether it would arrive too late to matter. I closed my eyes, steadied my breathing, and reminded myself of the one truth I had carried with me since the moment Director Ashford first asked me to go. I had not been sent to beg. I had been sent to speak, plainly, honestly, and without apology, for a species that had spent 22 years being underestimated by almost everyone who had ever bothered to look at us at all. The ship touched down, the hatch began to open, and somewhere far above the chamber, unseen by any delegate waiting inside it, the fleet still circling my homeworld continued its patient, silent countdown, waiting to learn whether the man stepping out onto that landing spire would return to tell them the quarantine was finally over, or whether he would never return at all. The chamber of the 900 was nothing like the images I had studied for years in briefing rooms back home. Those images had shown me scale, a bowl of golden light 3 kilometers wide, tiers of seating rising toward a ceiling lost in haze, But no image had prepared me for what it felt like to stand at the center of it. One small figure on a dais built for judgment, with 900 pairs of eyes, some familiar in shape, many utterly alien, all turned toward me at once. An escort had walked me from the landing spire through a corridor lined with guards from a dozen species, none of whom spoke to me, all of whom watched me the way you watch something you have already decided is dangerous, waiting only for confirmation. Kavash had stopped at the chamber's outer doors, unable to accompany me further. "This is as far as council protocol allows," he said. "Whatever happens beyond these doors, Speaker Voss, you face alone." "I understand," I said, though understanding it and feeling ready for it were two very different things. "For what it is worth," he added, "I hope your species proves me wrong about everything I believed the day we met." I stepped through the doors before I could think of a proper response, and the sound of 900 conversations dropped to nothing the moment my presence registered across the chamber. A single dais waited at the center, reachable by a long walkway suspended over open air, and I made that walk with my coat, my data slate, and 11 words rehearsed so many times they no longer felt like language at all, only breath. At the head of the chamber, on a raised platform separate from the rest, sat Thal Oreson, Speaker of the 900, an ancient Vectar administrator whose position predated every treaty humanity had ever signed with this galaxy. Age had thinned her frame but had done nothing to soften the sharpness in her gaze as she watched me approach. "Humanity's last speaker," she said, her voice carried effortlessly to every corner of the chamber by systems I could not see. "You requested this audience. Speak and be heard, for what this council has already determined will be the final time such an audience is granted." The words "final time" landed exactly as heavily as I had feared they would, a public confirmation that whatever vote had brought me here, it was not one built with patience for a second hearing. I looked up at the tiers surrounding me, rows upon rows of faces from 841 species, and understood, in that moment, that the version of this speech I had rehearsed for months, full of careful legal arguments about proportionality and sovereignty, was the wrong speech for this room. A room that had already decided what it believed about my species would not be moved by careful language. It required something else entirely. "Before I speak," I said, "I ask permission to present a recording. It will take 4 minutes. I ask that the chamber allow it to play in full, without interruption." A murmur rippled through the tiers, and I watched several delegates lean toward one another, exchanging glances that ranged from curious to openly hostile. Thal Oreson studied me a long moment before responding. 4 minutes, she said, no more. I placed the data slate on the small pedestal built into the dais for exactly this purpose, and pressed the single control that activated the file I had carried across the galaxy, without ever once listening to it myself. It began not with words but with a simple status log, rendered in plain council standard, scrolling steadily across the vast projection screens that rose behind me for every delegate to read. It described, in careful, unemotional language, the existence of a network built entirely within the empty space between my home system's checkpoints and its sun, a stretch of space no treaty had ever thought worth monitoring because nothing had ever been built there before. As the log continued, murmurs turned to open exclamations. I watched delegates across multiple tiers rise from their seats, some in anger, some in what looked unmistakably like fear. A representative from a species I recognized as Satari, tall and silver-skinned, shouted something in a dialect too fast for my translator to catch cleanly, though the tone required no translation at all. The recording reached its final line as the 4 minutes ended, and the words hung projected above the entire chamber, for every delegate present to read for themselves. All primary and secondary relay nodes report ready status, awaiting confirmation from the last speaker. Estimated time to full defense saturation across all currently orbiting council vessels, should activation become necessary, 11 minutes. The chamber fell into a silence unlike anything I imagine it had held in its 11,000 years of history, a silence so complete that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. "You built this," Thal Oreson said finally, her voice quieter than before, though it carried no less weight for the change. "During the quarantine you were told existed for your own containment. We built it because we were told, quite plainly, by this very chamber, that our existence had already been judged dangerous before we were ever given the chance to prove otherwise," I said. "You built a wall around us, and then stopped watching what happened on the other side of it, because you assumed a species behind a wall has no reason to keep working. That assumption was the only mistake we ever needed you to make." A delegate near the front tier, a broad-shouldered Thren elder wearing the formal markings of a war council seat, rose to his feet. "This is a confession of aggression," he said, his voice booming through the chamber. You stand before this council and admit to building weapons in direct violation of quarantine terms. I stand before this council and admit to building a deterrent, I corrected, keeping my voice level, though every part of me wanted to match his volume. There is a difference, and I believe every species in this room understands that difference intimately, because every species in this room has, at some point in its own history, built exactly such a thing to protect itself from a neighbor it did not yet trust. A deterrent implies restraint, Thal Orson said. What you have described implies the capacity to end every council fleet currently deployed across this galaxy, simultaneously, without warning. It implies the capacity, I agreed, not the intention. There is a wide and important distance between those two words, Speaker of the 900, and I did not cross this galaxy alone, unarmed and without escort, to close that distance. I crossed it to ask this chamber, plainly and honestly, why a species that has never once used force against you is being measured today by its capacity for force rather than its record of restraint. For a long moment no one answered. I watched the tears, watched delegates who had entered this chamber that day expecting a short, formal proceeding ending in a vote already decided, now visibly recalculating everything they believed they understood about the small, quarantined species they had come to judge. A younger delegate from a species called the Orendel, whom I recognized from years of study as historically cautious, almost neutral in most council disputes, rose slowly from her seat. Her voice, when it came, was steady, thoughtful, entirely without the anger that had colored the Thren Elder's outburst. "Speaker Voss," she said, "if what you describe is true, why reveal it at all? A hidden deterrent loses much of its value the moment its existence becomes known. Why not simply allow this council to vote in ignorance, and activate your network only if the vote went against you?" It was, I realized, the single most important question anyone in that chamber could have asked, and I was grateful someone finally had. Because a deterrent used in silence, after the fact, ends in destruction on both sides, I said. And I did not travel here hoping for destruction on either side, delegate. I traveled here hoping this council might choose, with full and complete information, to end a quarantine that has already outlived any justification it may once have had, and to admit a species into this galaxy as an equal rather than a prisoner. Silence would have given you a vote made in ignorance. I preferred to give you a vote made with the truth in front of you, however uncomfortable that truth might be. Murmurs spread again through the tears, quieter this time, more contemplative than outraged. Thal Orson let the sound settle before speaking again. "You understand," she said, "that revealing this network changes nothing about the fear that led this council to consider ending the quarantine so severely in the first place. If anything, Speaker Voss, you have just confirmed the very danger this chamber gathered today to address." "I have confirmed a capability," I said, "not a threat. Every species in this chamber holds capabilities its neighbors would find frightening if fully understood. What separates a threat from a capability is intention. And my intention, stated here plainly before 841 species, is this. Humanity does not wish to harm this council, or any world represented within it. Humanity wishes only to no longer be judged, quarantined, or condemned, for the crime of surviving quietly, while the rest of this galaxy assumed silence meant weakness." The broad-shouldered Thren Elder who had first accused me of confessing aggression remained standing, his expression unreadable. "And if this council chooses, despite your words, to proceed with the original vote," he said, "if we choose, here and now, to authorize the fleet already stationed at your system's edge, to end the quarantine permanently. What then, Speaker Voss?" I let the question hang a moment before answering, because I wanted every delegate in that chamber to understand that what I said next was not a threat delivered in anger, but a plain accounting of consequence, spoken as calmly as I could manage. "Then this chamber will learn, within 11 minutes of that fleet receiving its order, exactly how thoroughly a species can prepare for a judgment it was warned, for 22 years, might one day be handed down against it," I said. "I take no pleasure in saying that. I would infinitely prefer this council choose differently, but I did not come here to lie to you about what happens if you do not." Before Thal Orson could speak again, another delegate rose from the upper tiers, an elderly figure from a species called the Miran, small and quiet, rarely heard from in any session I had studied during my years of preparation. His voice, when it came, was soft, but the chamber quieted instantly to hear it, the particular respect reserved for someone who speaks only when they believe it truly matters. "I have sat in this chamber for longer than most delegates here have been alive," he said. "I remember the day this council voted to quarantine the human system. I remember the fear in that room, fear that felt entirely justified at the time, based on the destruction of 3 of our own vessels. I did not vote against that quarantine. because I believed, as many of us did, that caution was the only responsible choice available to us. He paused, and the chamber waited, no one daring to interrupt him. I find myself now wondering, he continued, whether the true failure in this matter was never the human species at all, but this council's own unwillingness to revisit a fear once it had been acted upon. We built a wall and called it wisdom, and then we stopped asking whether the wisdom still applied. Speaker Voss did not come here today to threaten this chamber. He came here to remind us that walls left unexamined for 22 years tend to hide more than they reveal, on both sides of the stone. A ripple of quiet agreement moved through several tiers, though the broad-shouldered Thren elder remained rigid, his expression unmoved by the old Mirran's words. Sentiment does not undo a demonstrated capability for destruction, the Thren elder said sharply. This chamber cannot govern 841 species by nostalgia for the caution we once showed, a species that has now proven our caution was, if anything, too generous, or precisely generous enough, the Mirran delegate answered calmly, to prevent the very outcome you now fear, Elder. A species pushed further into a corner it did not deserve to occupy might have chosen a very different 4 minutes to show us today. Thal Oresin allowed the exchange to run its course before raising a hand for order, and the chamber settled once more into the tense, waiting silence that had defined nearly every minute since I had first stepped onto that dais. She studied me for a long moment, her ancient eyes unreadable, and then turned to address the full chamber, her voice carrying the particular weight of someone who understood that whatever she said next would be remembered for as long as this council itself continued to exist. This chamber will recess for deliberation, she announced. A vote will follow. Speaker Voss will remain present for its outcome. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices the moment the recess was announced, delegates turning to one another, some already arguing, others simply staring at me with expressions I could not fully read across so many unfamiliar faces. I stood alone on the dais, my coat, my data slate, and 11 minutes of consequence resting quietly behind me, and understood that the hardest part of this journey, the part I had rehearsed for months without ever truly believing I would survive to see it, had only just begun. The recess stretched on for nearly 3 hours, though inside the chamber, time seemed to move differently, thick and slow. Every minute waited with the knowledge that somewhere far beyond these walls, a fleet still circled my homeworld waiting for a single order that could end everything I loved before I ever had the chance to return to it. I was not permitted to leave the dais. Guards from 3 different species stood at careful distances around me, not quite hostile, not quite protective, simply present, as though no one yet knew which role they might be called upon to play, depending on how the vote concluded. I sat with my coat gathered around me and watched the tiers above, where delegates moved between clusters, arguing in dialects my translator caught only in fragments. Phrases like unprecedented capability and cannot be allowed to stand, and if this is true of one species drifting down to me like smoke. It was during that long recess that I finally understood something Kavash had tried gently to warn me of during our journey. This vote was never only about my species. It was about every species in this chamber who had ever quietly built something behind closed doors, and hoped no one would ever ask what it was for. My revelation had not simply changed the terms of humanity's judgment. It had reminded 841 other worlds of a fear they had spent centuries trying to forget they carried about one another. Halfway through that long recess, something happened that no official record of the day would later fully explain. I had stepped toward the edge of the dais, stretching muscles gone stiff from standing so long under such pressure, when one of the guards positioned nearest me shifted his stance in a way that felt, immediately, wrong. He was Thren, tall, armored, and until that moment utterly still, and now his hand moved toward a small device clipped at his belt with a speed no routine posture required. I do not know, even now, what instinct made me step back rather than forward, but the movement likely saved me from whatever that device was built to do. A second guard, this one Sitari, silver-skinned and quick-eyed, seized the first guard's wrist before the device could clear its clip, and the two of them fell into a brief, violent struggle that ended only when 3 more guards converged to restrain the one who had moved against me. The chamber's own security swept in within seconds, and the offending guard was removed before I could see his face clearly enough to recognize him again, though I noted, with a chill that took hours to fade, that he wore markings I recognized from my studies as belonging to a security detachment personally staffed by the same broad-shouldered Thren elder who had twice risen to challenge me. Kavash, informed of the incident soon after by a runner sent from the chamber, arrived within minutes, his expression tight with a fury I had not seen from him before. "Are you harmed?" he asked, checking me over as though he expected to find some injury I had not yet noticed myself. I am fine, I said, though my hands had begun trembling again, the same tremor from the night the alarms first woke me. What was that device? A disruption charge, he said grimly. Small, difficult to trace, designed to look like a malfunction rather than an attack, if it had been used. Whoever authorized that guard's placement clearly hoped this vote would never need to conclude at all. Will there be consequences? I asked. There will be an inquiry, he said. Whether it produces consequences depends entirely on how many delegates in that chamber decide today that consequences are worth the trouble of pursuing against someone powerful enough to have arranged this in the first place. He studied me a moment longer, some of the fury softening into something closer to concern. You should know, Elias, that whatever protection council law promises a sitting speaker, it clearly was not enough today. I would ask that you remain close to me, or to security I personally trust, for whatever remains of this proceeding. I nodded, my pulse still loud in my own ears, and understood, more clearly than any legal briefing had ever managed to teach me, exactly how much danger a single unfinished vote could still carry, even after the arguments themselves had already been spoken. It was into that unsettled quiet, not long after, that a voice startled me from my thoughts. The younger Orendel delegate, the one who had asked the most important question in the earlier session, approached the edge of the dais, close enough to speak quietly without the guards intervening. Speaker Voss, she said, my name is Alara Bright, though that is a rough translation of my given name into your language. I wish to speak with you before the vote resumes. I am listening, Delegate Bright, I said. There are factions within this chamber who believe your revelation was itself an act of aggression, she said, regardless of your stated intentions. They argue that a species capable of hiding such a network from council censors for 22 years cannot be trusted regardless of what it claims to want now. I understand the argument, I said. I do not believe it is wrong to fear a capability like the one I described. I only hope this chamber can separate that fear from the question of what my species has actually done with the years it was given, which is nothing more than exist quietly, trade honestly within the narrow terms it was allowed, and wait for a chance to be judged fairly. There is another faction, she continued, glancing briefly toward the tiers above, led by delegates who voted most fiercely for the original quarantine 2 decades ago. They see this revelation not as a reason for caution, but as vindication. Proof, in their eyes, that their original fear of your species was correct all along, and that the only reasonable response now is to act before such a network can ever be used against them. My chest tightened at that. And which faction do you believe holds the larger voice in this chamber today, Delegate Bright? She hesitated before answering, and something in that hesitation told me the truth before her words did. I do not know, she admitted. This vote will likely be closer than any this chamber has held in generations. She glanced once more toward the upper tiers before leaning slightly closer, lowering her voice further still. There is something else you should know, Speaker Voss, though I ask that you never repeat where you heard it. 3 nights ago, before this session was even formally called, several of those 206 met privately in a chamber not meant for such gatherings. I was not present, but a colleague I trust was, quietly, in a capacity that required her presence for unrelated reasons. She tells me the discussion was not about whether to vote against you, it was about what to do if the vote did not go their way regardless. My chest tightened. What did they discuss doing? She would not say precisely, Alara Bright admitted. Only that the word contingency was used more than once, and that the Thren Elder you have already crossed words with twice today was among the loudest voices in that room. She straightened, glancing again toward the tiers as though worried her absence had already been noticed. I tell you this not because I know what it means, but because I believe you deserve to walk out of today's vote, whatever its outcome, with clear eyes about what may still follow it. Thank you, Delegate Bright, I said, meaning it more than the simple words could carry. Why tell me at all? You owe my species nothing. Perhaps not, she said, but my own world spent 3 centuries as a minor territory under a larger neighbor's quiet control, before this very council finally recognized us as equals. I remember what it felt like to be judged by capability, rather than conduct. I would not wish that feeling on any species, human or otherwise, if I had the chance to prevent it. She left before I could respond further, called back to her tier by a colleague, and I sat alone again with the weight of her words settling over me, like the recycled air of the adjudicator's reach had settled over me, during those long, uncertain days of travel. When the recess finally ended, Thal Orson returned to her platform, and the chamber quieted with a speed that told me every delegate present understood exactly how much rested on what came next. This council has deliberated, she announced. A vote will now be taken on 2 matters, separately and in sequence. First, whether to authorize immediate action against the human home system, in light of the revelation presented before this chamber today. Second, should the first matter fail to pass, whether to formally end the quarantine agreement and grant humanity provisional standing among this council's member worlds. The voting mechanism activated across the chamber, small lights blooming above each delegate's seat, one color for support, another for opposition, a system I had studied in briefings but never expected to watch decide my species' future in real time. The first matter, the vote to authorize action against my home world, began, and I forced myself to watch the lights bloom across the tiers rather than look away, because I owed it to everyone waiting back home to witness this moment fully, whatever it revealed. Lights bloomed red, and lights bloomed a pale gold that I understood, from months of study, indicated opposition. The tally rose steadily on both sides, and I found myself counting under my breath, a habit I could not stop even knowing the final number would be displayed clearly the moment the vote concluded. The broad-shouldered Thren elder who had accused me of confessing aggression voted red, without hesitation, his expression carved from stone. Several delegates near him followed his lead, a block I recognized from my studies as historically aligned with the original quarantine decision 2 decades earlier. But across other tiers, gold lights bloomed as well, more than I had allowed myself to hope for. Delegate Bright's seat lit gold. Several delegations from smaller, less powerful worlds, species who had themselves once feared being judged too quickly by more powerful neighbors, lit gold in numbers that steadily narrowed the gap. The final tally displayed above the chamber, and I read it twice before allowing myself to believe it. 206 red, 694 gold. The chamber remained silent as the numbers settled, and Thal Orison's voice, when it came, carried something I had not heard from her before, a note that might have been relief, though I could not be certain across the distance of our 2 very different species. The motion to authorize action against the human home system fails, she said. This chamber will proceed to the second matter. I allowed myself exactly 1 breath of relief before the weight of the second vote settled over me just as heavily as the first. The lights above each seat reset, and the tally for the quarantine's end began. This vote moved differently than the first, slower, more considered, delegates pausing before committing their choice in a way that told me this decision, unlike the first, was not one made from fear, but from genuine deliberation about what kind of galaxy they wished to build going forward. Gold lights bloomed steadily, a clear majority forming even before the final tally completed, though a stubborn cluster of red remained, the same 206 delegates, I realized with a slow chill, who had voted for my species' destruction only minutes earlier, now voting just as firmly against our admission as equals. The final number displayed, 694 gold, 206 red. The motion passes, Thal Orison announced. The quarantine agreement governing the human home system is hereby ended, effective immediately. Humanity is granted provisional standing among this council's member worlds, subject to further formal proceedings to be scheduled in the coming cycle. The chamber erupted, not in celebration, but in a complicated wave of overlapping reactions, some delegates rising to offer what I understood, from their body language, to be cautious approval, others remaining seated, arms crossed, faces unreadable, and a smaller cluster near the front tiers, the same 206 who had twice voted against my species, sitting utterly still, their expressions carved from something that looked, even across the vast difference of species, unmistakably like fury. I found Kavash waiting for me just beyond the chamber's outer doors once the session formally adjourned, his expression somewhere between relief and disbelief. "You did it," he said. "I did not think, even after everything I witnessed on our journey here, that I would be saying those words today." 694 voices believed it was worth doing, I said. I only provided the reason. 206 did not, he said, and something in the careful way he said it told me he had noticed the same thing I had noticed, watching those particular delegates during the final tally. "Elias, I have served this council long enough to recognize when a defeat has been accepted, and when it has only been postponed. Those 206 did not look to me like people who intend to simply go home and accept today's outcome quietly. I thought of Grace's voice, recorded and waiting in my data slate, telling me to come home whatever happened. I thought of Laura standing at the transport bay in our father's old coat, refusing to cry. I thought of the fleet still circling my home system, and wondered, for the first time since stepping off the adjudicator's reach, whether the true danger of this entire journey had not yet even begun. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Kavash said, glancing back toward the chamber doors, where the 206 delegates were filing out in tight, quiet clusters, speaking among themselves in low voices. "I believe we should return you to your ship as quickly as this council's protocol will allow, Speaker Voss. and I believe, very strongly, that we should not wait for the formal proceedings Thal mentioned before doing so. We moved through the chamber's outer corridors faster than protocol strictly allowed, Kavash cutting through checkpoints with the authority of his writ, myself following close behind, my coat gathered tight around me, and my data slate held against my chest like something fragile that had already proven, twice now, to be anything but. "Explain to me what you fear exactly," I said, struggling to match his pace. 206 delegates just watched a species they spent 22 years dismissing walk into this chamber and change the terms of a vote they believed was already decided, he said. "Pride does not simply accept a defeat like that, Elias. It looks for another way to reach the same outcome." "The vote is finished," I said. "The quarantine is over. What outcome is left for them to reach?" "Your death," he said plainly, not slowing his pace. "Or your homeworlds, before the formal proceedings can make today's decision permanent and irreversible. A vote can be overturned, if the party it protects no longer exists, to claim its protection." The thought landed like ice water. I had spent months rehearsing arguments of law and days crossing the galaxy rehearsing arguments of survival, and it had never once occurred to me that surviving the chamber itself might not be the same as surviving the days that followed it. We reached the landing spire to find the adjudicator's reach exactly where we had left it, and Kavash wasted no time ushering me aboard, barking orders to his crew before the hatch had even fully sealed behind us. "Set course for the human system," he said. "Fastest corridor available, regardless of fuel cost." "Captain," one of his officers said, hesitating, "the fastest corridor passes directly through space currently being monitored by Thren compact vessels. Given the political tensions following today's vote, that route carries significant risk." "Every route carries risk today," Kavash said. "I would rather risk a corridor than risk arriving too late to matter." We broke away from Threndal Prime's gravity well faster than any departure I had experienced on the journey out, and I felt the first jump gate pull at my ribs again, this time welcoming the discomfort, because every jump meant distance closed, and distance closed meant home drew closer. On the third day of our return journey, an alert tore through the bridge exactly as it had on the outbound leg, though this time Kavash's expression carried none of the calm reassurance he had offered before. "Unregistered vessel formation," an officer reported, matching signatures logged to Thren compact military assets. 6 ships, course intercepts ours in approximately 40 minutes. "Not a patrol," Kavash said quietly, almost to himself. "A strike group. Belonging to whom?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Delegates do not command warships directly," Kavash said, "but delegates with enough influence, and enough anger, can convince a compliant admiral to act before formal orders catch up with him. I would wager everything I own that somewhere among those 6 ships flies an admiral who answers, quietly, to one of the 206. "What do we do?" I asked. "We cannot outrun them on this corridor," Kavash said, already working the console with quick, practiced movements. "But we do not need to outrun them, Elias. We only need to survive long enough to reach a jump gate they are not prepared to follow us through." He explained, as the minutes ticked away, that the adjudicator's reach carried a rarely used capability, an emergency short jump reserved for diplomatic vessels in genuine crisis, one that consumed almost the entirety of the ship's reserve power, but could carry us directly into the outer edge of my home system, bypassing 3 full corridors of travel in a single desperate leap. "Why not use it from the start?" I asked. "Because it can only be used once per journey, and only in confirmed emergency," he said, "and because until 40 minutes ago, I did not believe we were in one." The strike group closed steadily on our position, their formation tightening the way a predator's does before it commits fully to a chase. Kavash's crew worked in tense, coordinated silence, charging the emergency jump systems while simultaneously routing every available scrap of power away from anything not essential to our survival. 20 minutes to intercept, an officer reported. 15 minutes to jump readiness, Kavash answered. "We will not make it in time to avoid contact entirely." "Then what do we do for those 5 minutes?" I asked. "We convince them contact is not worth the cost," he said, and turned to me with an expression I had not seen from him before, something between apology and resolve. "Elias, does your species network extend this far? Could it reach us here, if needed?" I thought of the audio file, and the plain, careful log it had described, relay nodes built entirely within my own system's dead space. Nowhere near this corridor, nowhere near this ship. "No," I admitted. "Whatever protection I promised that chamber exists only around my home world. It cannot help us here." "Then we have only this ship," And whatever nerve remains between the two of us, he said, and opened a channel toward the approaching strike group before I could ask him what exactly he intended to say. This vessel operates under Council diplomatic writ, he announced, his voice carrying none of the fear I knew he must have felt. Carrying the accredited human representative whose testimony this chamber accepted only 3 days ago in a lawful, recorded vote. Any action taken against this vessel will be logged, permanently, as an attack against a sitting council delegate, regardless of which admiral's signature authorized it, and regardless of which delegate's anger inspired that signature. Silence answered him for a long, unbearable stretch, long enough that I watched the strike group's formation on our tactical display, still closing, still tightening, giving no indication his words had landed at all. Then, slowly, the lead vessel's course shifted, a fractional adjustment that would have meant nothing to an untrained eye but meant everything to the officers watching our screens with held breath. The formation began to loosen. "They are breaking off," an officer said, disbelief plain in her voice. "For now," Kavash said, though relief had finally crept into his tone as well. An admiral willing to act on a delegate's private anger is rarely willing to have that action logged formally against his own name. Today, that hesitation was enough. We reached the jump gate without further incident, and the emergency short jump carried us across the remaining distance in a single wrenching pull that left every person aboard gasping, but delivered us, finally, to the outer edge of my home system, close enough that I could see, on our approach display, the 12 ships still circling my world, patient, silent, exactly as they had been the night I left. A transmission reached us moments later, carrying a voice I had not expected to hear so soon, Director Ashford, his tone carefully controlled but unable to fully hide the strain beneath it. "Voss," he said, "we received word from the council relay an hour ago. The vote passed. The quarantine is ended." He paused. "We also received word, separately, of an unauthorized strike group operating near your return corridor. Tell me you are alive to explain that to me in person." "I am alive, Director," I said, my voice rougher than I expected. "And I would very much like to explain it in person, from somewhere with solid ground beneath my feet." The 12 ships still circling my world began, one by one, to alter their formation as the Council's official confirmation reached them, their patient blockade dissolving into a loose, watchful presence that no longer resembled a noose, so much as a formality waiting to be dismissed entirely. I stood in the observation lounge of the adjudicator's reach as we made our final approach, watching my home world grow from a point of light into the familiar blue and green sphere I had left what felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 11 days. Kavash joined me there, quiet for a long moment before speaking. "You will go home, to a world that no longer lives behind a wall," he said. "That is no small thing, Elias Voss." "No," I agreed. "It is not." "And the 206, he said. "I do not believe today's outcome ends their anger. I believe it only delays it." I thought of Alara Bright's careful warning, of the fury I had seen carved into the faces of those delegates as the final tally displayed above the chamber, and understood that Kavash was almost certainly right. Some fights end cleanly, others simply change shape and weight. "Then we will be ready for whatever shape it takes next," I said, the same way we were ready this time, quietly, patiently, and without ever mistaking caution for weakness. The ship touched down on my home station's landing platform, and a hatch opened to reveal Grace Whitmore standing exactly where I had left her, tablet still pressed against her chest, though her expression now carried something closer to disbelief than fear. Beside her stood Laura, our father's old coat still draped over her shoulders, finally, openly, crying. I stepped off the adjudicator's reach onto solid ground for the first time in 11 days, carrying a data slate that had once held a single unopened file capable of changing the fate of an entire species, and a coat that had traveled farther than any garment in my family's history, and I understood, standing there with the people I loved gathered around me, that whatever came next, whatever shape the anger of 206 delegates eventually took, my species had finally been given something it had waited 22 years to receive. Not mercy, not forgiveness, simply the chance, at long last, to be judged as an equal, and to answer, on our own terms, whatever the galaxy asked of us next. 3 weeks passed before Kavash's warning proved itself entirely correct. I had returned to a quieter life than I expected, meeting with Director Ashford and a small circle of advisors to plan for the formal proceedings still to come, when Grace found me late one evening with a message flagged urgent from a source she would not name over open channels. "It is from Alara Bright," she said, once we were somewhere private enough to speak freely, sent through a relay she was clearly not supposed to have access to. The message was short, careful. worded exactly the way I imagined a delegate would word something she intended to be deniable, if ever discovered. It said only that a private vessel, unregistered, had departed Threndal Prime's outer ring 4 days earlier, carrying, among its listed crew, several names belonging to close associates of the Thren Elder, who had twice challenged me in the chamber. Its declared destination was a routine survey mission in unclaimed space. Its actual course, according to whoever had passed this information to Alara Bright, bent quietly toward the very dead zone between our checkpoints and our sun, the empty stretch of space I had described to the entire council only weeks earlier. "They are testing it," Grace said, once I had finished reading. "Or trying to disable it before the formal proceedings make the quarantine's end permanent and impossible to reverse." "Either way," I said, "they are flying directly into the one place I told 900 delegates, on the record, holds a working defense network." "Do we warn them?" Grace asked. "Do we send some kind of signal, tell them to turn back before it is too late?" I thought of Alara Bright's quiet warning in the chamber, of the word contingency spoken in a private room 3 nights before the vote, of a species that had spent 22 years being told its existence was already a crime waiting to be punished. I thought too of the plain, careful log that had scrolled across 900 screens describing exactly what waited in that dead space, offered honestly, in full view, to any delegate willing to listen. "We already warned them," I said quietly. "In the chamber, in front of every world that matters, in words translated into every dialect this council uses. They chose not to listen then. I do not believe a private signal now would change a decision they already made in that private room 3 nights before the vote." The unregistered vessel entered the dead zone 2 days later, according to the last confirmed sensor reading any outside source ever recorded of its position. It did not reappear on any tracking system afterward, not at its declared survey coordinates, not at any checkpoint along its return route, not anywhere across the wide, quiet stretch of space it had chosen to cross so carefully and so secretly. The council opened a formal inquiry within the month, as protocol required whenever a registered vessel failed to report at its scheduled intervals. I was called to testify, along with representatives from 3 other species who had tracked portions of the ship's early course, before it slipped into the unmonitored dead zone. I answered every question honestly. I confirmed, plainly and without embellishment, exactly what I had already told the full chamber weeks earlier, that the dead zone contained a defense network built to activate only in response to a confirmed hostile action against my home system, and that no order had ever been given, by me or by anyone in my government, to activate it against any vessel, registered or otherwise. The inquiry concluded after many long sessions that the vessel's fate could not be determined with certainty, and that its listed survey mission had, according to council records, never been formally authorized in the first place, a fact that closed most of the remaining questions before they could be asked too loudly. Thalorison never spoke of it directly in my presence, though I noticed, in the months that followed, that the 206 seats which had voted so fiercely against my species now sat, in several cases, occupied by new faces entirely, quieter delegates sent to replace elders and representatives whose own governments had grown uneasy about exactly what their predecessors had attempted, and exactly why they had never returned home to explain it. Kavash visited my home world once, nearly a year later, no longer a council captain assigned to ferry frightened diplomats across the galaxy, but simply a friend, curious to see the place that had so thoroughly rearranged his understanding of what a quiet species might be capable of, when finally given the chance to speak for itself. We stood together on the same landing platform where Grace and Laura had once waited for my return, watching a sky no longer patrolled by a blockade, no longer sealed behind a wall built from someone else's fear. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked. "The revelation, the vote, everything that followed." I thought of the 206 who had chosen contingency over acceptance, and of the vessel that had entered a quiet stretch of space, and never come home to explain why. "I regret that it was necessary," I said. "I do not regret that we were finally heard." He nodded, and together we watched the sky, no longer waiting for permission to exist within it, simply living beneath it, the way any equal species should have been allowed to all along.